A lot of people out there have said, hey, Clay, how did you end up talking about COVID so much? And one answer is because of how much it was directly connected to sports. And for those of you who are long-term fans of me or Outkick, you know that in March and April and May and on into June, I didn't miss a day of my daily sports talk radio show, even though sports were shut down and there was virtually nothing going on with them. I still showed up and did 3 hours of daily radio talking about COVID, ways to find ways to play sports, all the different storylines that were attributed there. And one of the interesting parts of the sports intersection with the world of COVID is we have got really good data coming out of the sports leagues because the players are a relatively small subset of Americans and because they're being tested all the time. So we end up with somewhat reliable data. Now, it is a small subset of the larger American population, but I do think it's worthwhile in discussing. And today, the NHL came out with their data. And I want to talk about this because I think it tells a pretty intriguing story. The NHL rosters, as well as the coaches and the players and everybody else that is affiliated with the players, the training staff, everybody else, everybody was vaccinated in the NHL. Because of the Canadian situation, the NHL had essentially a 100% COVID vaccination rate. Well, the NHL just came out and said that despite 100% of the players being vaccinated, 73% of the league's rosters had tested positive for COVID this season, including 60% who have tested positive in the last 5 weeks. So, despite the fact that we have a 100% vaccination rate with NHL players, and granted NHL players are a younger and healthier subset of the larger American populace, but even with a 100% vaccination rate for NHL players, 73% of those players still tested positive for COVID. And so, this is really significant, all right? This is really significant because what it shows us is beyond a shadow of a doubt what Joe Biden and Dr. Fauci and Rochelle Walensky at the CDC, what they have tried to sell us is this massive difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated. And in fact, what they have said for months now is if everybody were vaccinated, COVID would go away. But that's not true at all, because we have a 100% vaccination rate in the NHL, young and healthy athletes who are under no risk from COVID, and yet they still have ended up 73% of them testing positive for COVID already. We're only halfway through the NHL season. So, what I believe becomes significant there is there's no benefit whatsoever to young, healthy athletes having even gotten the COVID shot. Why? Why is that? Because if they are still going to get COVID, and if they are still going to spread COVID, what benefit at all did NBA, NHL, and NFL players, not to mention all the college kids, actually receive from the COVID shot? Particularly because even the CEO of Pfizer himself now says that there's limited, if any, protection for the first 2 shots from COVID vaccine against the Omicron variant. In fact, the data out of Israel reflects that even after 4 shots in Israel, still limited to no protection from Omicron from the COVID vaccine. Well, I don't know about you, but if you give somebody 4 shots in a year and tell them it will protect them against COVID, and then they still get COVID, that's not a vaccine. Sorry, that's not a vaccine. If you or I had gotten the measles vaccine, and then we had tested positive for measles after getting 4 shots for it, I think a lot of us would say, wait a minute, that measles vaccine really didn't do a lot of good for me, yet somehow you're not allowed to say this about the COVID shot. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's ridiculous. It's an upside down world that we live in. And I want to give a shout out too I really wonder, I mean, legitimately, are people who are like die-in-the-wool, diehard Fauci advocates, Rochelle Walensky advocates, Joe Biden's COVID response advocates, do they actually look at any of the data? And if so, how is it that they continue to carry water for these people who have been wrong about virtually everything for 2 years? And I think it ties in. We had the Supreme Court oral arguments about whether or not the COVID vaccine mandate, Joe Biden's COVID vaccine mandate, was legal or not. You know, we had that big discussion. We had that big debate. And thankfully, the Supreme Court at least struck it down in terms of the mandate under OSHA for 84 million people out there. 2 out of 3 of every American worker, they struck it down. But they still allowed it for healthcare workers, which I think is wrong. But it was noted during those oral arguments that Justice Gorsuch was not wearing a mask. It was also noted that all of the Supreme Court justices are double vaccinated and they also have been boosted. So Sonia Sotomayor, Supreme Court Justice, who said that there were 100,000 kids currently dealing with COVID, many of them on ventilators, totally wrong. No scientific basis whatsoever, no factual basis to support that. She is double vaccinated and she is boosted, yet she is too afraid to sit next to Justice Gorsuch unless he wears a mask. Well, he refused to wear a mask, and so she wouldn't show up in person for the oral arguments. Isn't that a clear sign that Justice Sotomayor knows that the vaccines don't work that well? Because if you're double vaxxed, and you have a booster, you're not only willing to acknowledge that the vaccines don't work, but you're putting an awful lot of faith in a mask to protect you, even though we all know that the cloth masks that the Supreme Court justices were wearing are, based on the data, virtually worthless. And I didn't set out to be the most sane man in media. It's just where I have ended up because everyone else has gone so insane that I've ended up here, sitting here talking to you, already had COVID twice, already recovered from COVID with no issues, both in November of 2020 and just last week I tested positive for COVID, probably the Omicron version since it's a 99% variant that is flooding around right now, and also because I already had COVID before. So the overwhelming data would suggest that I had the Omicron version, kicked its ass. I'm 2-0, no issues, didn't need to be ventilated, didn't need to be hospitalized. I know I upset the blue check brigades, but I actually give credit to Justice Gorsuch for recognizing that masks actually make no discernible difference and that he's not going to wear one when he's already been double vaxxed and also been boosted. He's actually making the most rational decision of anyone on the entire Supreme Court.